The corner office on the 32nd floor of Carter Industries was where Javier Carter spent most of his days. It showed all the hard work he had done, but also all the things he had lost. The sunlight came through the big windows, casting long shadows on his big desk where papers waited for his signature. His mom, Martina, always said that success was measured by how high up you go and how big your office is. At 35 years old, Javier had everything people thought he should have. He was the CEO of a big company in business magazines and invited to all the fancy parties. But when he looked at his reflection in the window, he didn't see happiness. His hair was starting to turn gray, and his green eyes didn't sparkle the way they used to. "Mr. Carter," his assistant's voice came through the intercom. "The board is waiting in the conference room." 5 minutes, Javier replied, his voice sounding tired, like he said the same thing every day. He pressed the button to turn off the intercom and reached for his suit jacket. His eyes caught the small brass compass on his desk. It was the only personal thing he kept in his office, a gift from Isabel on their first anniversary. The compass had the words, "Together we'll find our way," written on it. Javier remembered the day he told Isabel he wanted a divorce. He still remembered how her hands shook when she took off her wedding ring and left it on the kitchen counter. She had said, "Sometimes the hardest part isn't losing someone, it's watching them choose to walk away." The board meeting was long and boring. People were talking about business stuff like market shares and profit. Javier didn't pay much attention. Instead, he doodled in his notebook, making little circles, just like Isabel used to do when she was nervous. He wondered if she still did that. "Mr. Carter," asked Richard Bennett, his CFO, "what do you think about the merger?" Javier snapped out of his thoughts. "Proceed with the due diligence, but I want environmental impact reports before we move forward." He answered without thinking. Business training kicked in automatically. After a few more hours of meetings and calls, Javier needed a break. He told his assistant, Diana, that he was going for a walk, ignoring her reminder about his next appointment. Central Park in early autumn looked beautiful with its colorful leaves against the city's tall buildings. Javier loosened his tie and walked, breathing in the fresh air. Isabel had always loved this time of year. She used to drag him to the park on Sunday afternoons to see the leaves before they fell. As he walked, he heard a child's laughter. He turned toward the sound, and everything stopped. There, by the old carousel, stood Isabel. Her hair was shorter now, but he knew her immediately. She was chasing a little boy, laughing as she spun him around. The boy was about 6 or 7, with dark curly hair and a red and white striped sweater. He looked so happy. Then the boy called out, "Mom!" Javier felt a jolt in his chest. Isabel smiled and said, "Well, I suppose we could get ice cream." Javier couldn't move. The boy's face looked so familiar. He had always wanted children, but Isabel had never been able to have them. Doctors had told them it wasn't possible. But here was Isabel with a son. Javier watched them walk away toward the ice cream cart, and he couldn't understand what was happening. The boy wasn't born after their divorce. He couldn't be. But Javier felt a horrible truth in his heart. The world he had built with his work and his walls around the past was about to come crashing down. He stood frozen, staring after them. His phone was buzzing, probably Diana reminding him about his next meeting, but he couldn't focus on anything but the boy. He couldn't believe it, but he knew it was true. He canceled his afternoon meetings. Some questions were too important to wait. Isabel Thompson sat in her kitchen, holding a cup of chamomile tea. She thought about the morning in the park with Mateo, her son, but something had bothered her during that visit. She had felt someone watching them, a familiar presence that made her uneasy. "Mom," Mateo said, walking into the kitchen in his dinosaur pajamas, holding his favorite book. "Can we read one more chapter?" Isabel smiled, pushing away the uneasy feeling. "Okay, but only one more." She loved their little home. It wasn't fancy, but it was filled with love and memories. Mateo jumped into her lap as they read the book together. "Tell me again about the day you found me," Mateo asked. It was his favorite story. Isabel told him about the day she was volunteering at a children's center when a quiet one-year-old boy crawled into her lap. That boy was Mateo. After her divorce, Isabel had thrown herself into helping other people. But when Mateo came into her life, everything changed. He became her reason to keep going. Later, Isabel tucked Mateo into bed and went to her office to work. On her cork board was a photo strip from Coney Island, taken when she and Javier were young and happy. She had meant to take it down many times, but something always stopped her. She had moved on from Javier, but part of her still held on to that memory. Her phone buzzed with a text from her friend Abigail. "Saw the merger news. You okay?" Isabel replied, "All good. Ancient history." But her hands shook as she set the phone down. Earlier in the park, she had seen Javier. Just for a second, when Mateo was laughing, she had seen Javier in him. It scared her. Isabel went to Mateo's room to check on him, watching him sleep. She felt thankful for the life she had built with him. But she also knew that Javier might find out about Mateo, and that worried her. She had rebuilt her life after the divorce, but the thought of Javier coming back into it made her feel anxious. Javier sat in his car outside his mother's house in Connecticut. He held the brass compass from his office in his pocket, like a good luck charm for the hard conversation ahead. His mother, Martina, always had a big influence on him, but today was different. Today, he wasn't looking for her approval. He walked into her house, which looked as perfect as always, with a smell of vanilla in the air. Javier was feeling nervous but determined. "Mother," he said as he followed her to the sitting room. She was already serving tea, knowing he was coming. He picked up a cup but stayed standing. "I need information about Isabel," he said. Martina looked at him carefully. "Isabel Thompson? Surely you're not still." She stopped and studied his face. "What's happened?" "I saw her yesterday," Javier said quietly, "in the park with her son." Martina's eyebrows were perfectly manicured, arching in disbelief as she listened to her son. Javier could tell she didn't quite believe him. Her eyes narrowed, sharp and calculating, the way they always had when she was trying to figure someone out. He had seen it 100 times before. Javier remembered the carousel, watching his mother's expression change from surprise to one of deep thought. The boy had been about 6 years old, playing around in the park, but there was something in the way he smiled that looked eerily familiar. "Exactly when did you see this?" Martina's voice broke through his thoughts. It was the same tone she had used when Javier was younger and being difficult. She had always been stern and firm, and it was clear she wasn't about to soften for him now. "You're running a billion-dollar company, Javier, and you think you saw something you didn't? Do you really know what you're talking about?" Martina asked, her voice becoming sharp, annoyed. Javier felt his frustration building. He could feel his temper rising. His patience, worn thin over the years, snapped. "I know what I saw," he said, the words coming out more forcefully than he intended. "Tell me if there's anything you haven't told me about Isabel's condition. Why were you so insistent that I leave?" His mother stood up, turning away to look out the window. She didn't seem to want to face him, but her words cut through the air with a cold edge. "I did what any mother would do," she said, her back to him. "You were destroying yourself trying to build a family with someone who couldn't give you one." Javier frowned. He knew his mother well enough to recognize her hidden agenda. He cut her off, his voice low and sharp. "The Carters always have an heir," he said. "It's about preserving the bloodline. Tell me, Mother, was it really about my happiness, or was it about your legacy?" The room fell silent, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Javier couldn't help but glance at the family photos on the walls, all generations of success and achievement. There was a lot of pride in the air, pride in being a Carter, pride in fulfilling the family expectations. Javier sighed, feeling suffocated by it. Finally, Martina spoke. I hired a private investigator. If you want answers, that's where you'll find them. Javier felt his heart sink. He didn't want to go down that route. He wanted the truth, but not from someone else, not from an investigator who would only dig into his past. He pulled a small compass from his pocket, its brass surface catching the afternoon light as he turned it over in his hand. It had been his father's, and it reminded him that some answers were better found on his own. Some answers I have to find myself, he muttered, more to himself than to his mother. Later that day, back in his car, Javier pulled out his phone. Diana answered on the first ring. I need everything you can find about Isabel Thompson, he said. Where she works, where she lives. Everything. And I also need you to pull my old medical insurance records from around the time of the divorce. Anything related to fertility treatments, especially consultations. There was a pause on the other end. Diana hesitated, but Javier didn't give her a chance to question him. All of it, Diana, and this stays between us. Javier drove through the streets, his mind racing with memories of his past, of Isabel, and of the choices he had made. The night he left still haunted him. He remembered how Isabel stood there in their kitchen, small but somehow strong. She didn't cry, didn't beg him to stay. She simply asked one question, a question that had stayed with him all this time. Is this really what you want, or is it what you think you should want? Back then, he hadn't understood the difference. He thought he was making the right choice. Now he wasn't so sure. His phone rang again. It was Diana. Sir, I found something, she said. Isabel Thompson is an editor at Wonderland Publishing. She works with children's books. But there's more. I found out the clinic where you both were treated had a class action lawsuit filed against them 2 years after your divorce. There were several women who were misdiagnosed, told they couldn't have children when they actually could. The clinic settled out of court, but all the records were sealed. Javier felt his stomach twist. It was like a punch in the gut. Had Isabel known? Had she tried to tell him? The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. He remembered their last fertility appointment. Isabel had wanted a second opinion, but he had dismissed it as denial. He had been so certain that there was something wrong with her. He had never even considered the possibility that he might be the one with the problem. He drove straight to Wonderland Publishing's address, parking across the street. The building was much smaller than his corporate office, but it had a welcoming feel. Bright murals decorated the entrance, and through the glass doors he could see a wall full of colorful children's books. It was the kind of place Isabel would work, bright, creative, filled with stories. He sat in his car for a moment, watching. A woman walked past the window, arms full of manuscripts. She looked like Isabel. Javier sank lower in his seat, feeling like the coward he had been 5 years ago. He reached for the compass in his pocket, its weight a reminder of the past. His phone buzzed. It was his mother, but he ignored the call. He already knew what she would say. The Carters didn't look back. They moved forward, always chasing the next thing. But as Javier sat there watching through the window, he realized something that would have horrified his younger self. Some kinds of success felt like failure in disguise. And sometimes failure was the first step towards something real. He got out of the car and entered the building. The receptionist asked if he had an appointment. He didn't. He was just here to see Isabel. Isabel Thompson? The receptionist asked, glancing at her computer. Do you have an appointment? No, but I'll wait for her, Javier replied. Just then, Isabel walked out of an office, and Javier's heart skipped a beat. She looked exactly like she always had, strong, beautiful, with a quiet confidence that radiated from her. I thought I recognized your assistant's style of investigation, she said, her voice cool but controlled. She wasn't angry, just calm. Her eyes locked on his, and Javier felt the weight of her gaze. The receptionist looked between them, sensing the tension. It's okay, Amy. Isabel said, giving the receptionist a small smile. "I'll handle this." She led him through the office, past rows of cubicles decorated with book covers and character sketches. The smell of fresh paper and ink filled the air. They reached her office, a small but cozy space with a window overlooking a community garden. Isabel closed the door behind them and sat down at her desk. She didn't look at him, her hands folding neatly on top of the desk. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice steady. Javier stood there, feeling suddenly unsure. This wasn't the same woman who had once laughed with him in their kitchen late at night, or who had painted their spare room yellow, hoping to fill it with the sounds of a child. "I saw you in the park," Javier said, his voice tight, "with Mateo." Isabel's hand instinctively went to the necklace around her neck, a small silver key that Mateo had given her on adoption day. "So, you decided to investigate me?" she asked, her voice cold. "You had your assistant dig into my life?" "I needed to understand," Javier said, his eyes wandering around the room at the colorful books on the shelves. "When did you adopt him?" Isabel's face tightened. 3 months after our divorce. He was 1 year old, abandoned at birth. He needed a mother, and I needed—" She paused, recalculating. "I needed to give him a home." Javier stared at her, confused and hurt. "Why does it matter?" Isabel shook her head. "Because he looks like my father," Javier said, his voice breaking. "He has the Carter smile. And because I saw the lawsuit against the fertility clinic." Isabel went completely still. Her face was unreadable, but her hand went to her throat where the key was hanging. "What lawsuit?" she asked, her voice shaky. Javier took a step forward. "The clinic. They misdiagnosed several women, including you. They told them they couldn't have children when they actually could." Isabel didn't move. She didn't speak for a long time. Finally, her voice broke the silence. "Did you know?" Javier asked softly. "Did you know it was wrong?" Isabel stood up and rolled her chair back, pushing herself away from the desk. "Don't you dare make this about you," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You lost the right to ask me anything when you walked away, when you chose your family's legacy over our love." Javier's eyes dropped to the floor. He sank into one of the chairs, feeling the weight of the truth crushing him. Mateo was her son, and Isabel's voice was strong, like it could cut diamonds. She was upset. "If you're here to make things difficult just because you're curious or feel guilty, I don't know why I'm here," Javier said. It was the most honest thing he had said in years. When Isabel saw him in the park with Mateo, it made her feel like she had lost everything she thought she didn't need. Isabel smiled a little and picked up a book Javier had brought. She said, "Mateo loves this book about a boy who acts wild because he's hurting inside. It's about forgiveness and finding your way back." She placed the book down and added, "But life isn't like a children's book, Javier. You can't just come back and expect everything to be the same." Then Abigail came in saying, "Sorry, Isabel, your 2 appointment is here." Isabel told Abigail she'd be right there and looked back at Javier. "I need you to leave," she said. "I need you to stop asking Diana to investigate me. Mateo is my priority. His happiness and stability come first. I won't let anyone, not even you, threaten that." Javier stood up slowly, feeling the weight of his 35 years. What if I want to make things right? Right for whom? Isabel opened the office door and said, "Go back to your world, Javier. Go back to being the son your mother always wanted. Mateo and I will be fine. We have been for years." As Javier walked past her, their shoulders almost touching, he noticed a picture of Mateo on Isabel's computer screen. It was from Mateo's adoption day. His little hands were reaching for Isabel, his smile bright and trusting, just like the Carter family smile. In the lobby, Amy was reading to a group of kids. One of the little girls waved at Javier. He waved back without thinking. It reminded him of another child, one who could have been his. Javier stopped to look at a compass he carried. It used to be about success and winning. Now he wondered if it was trying to point him home all along. Mateo noticed something was different when his mom picked him up from school. She was distracted, not asking about his test like she usually did. "Mom, did one of your books get sick?" he asked, trying to make her laugh. She smiled, but it wasn't a real smile. "Books don't get sick," she said, but Mateo could tell something was wrong. She was making a lot of phone calls, talking about things like security and authorized pickups. He listened closely because sometimes grown-ups said important things when they thought kids weren't paying attention. His mom knelt beside him and said, "You know how Aunt Abigail picks you up sometimes? For a while, it will only be me or Aunt Abigail picking you up from places, okay?" Mateo frowned. "Even if they say they know you or me?" His mom nodded, "Especially if they say that." Mateo knew something was up. "Is it because of the man in the suit?" His mom froze. "What man?" "The man who watches our house sometimes. I saw him yesterday sitting in a fancy car across the street." His mom went very still. "What did he look like?" Mateo thought hard. "He was tall, like a giant, with gray hair like pepper and salt. He looked sad, like when I had to give away my old bike because I got too big for it." His mom quickly went to the window, looking out. The street outside seemed normal. She said, "Don't worry, we're not in danger. Sometimes grown-ups make things complicated." Later that night, after reading his favorite part of Where the Wild Things Are, Mateo asked, "Mom, do you believe in second chances?" His mom sat down beside him. "Second chances are complicated. Sometimes they're good, like with you and Danny, but sometimes they're like Max with the Wild Things." Mateo smiled, like when he went away to know he wanted to come home. His mom looked like she might cry, but then she kissed his forehead and smiled. "When did you get so wise? Get some sleep." Later that night, after everyone was quiet, Mateo saw the fancy car again outside. The man in the suit looked sad, but Mateo didn't feel scared anymore. He felt like the man was just lost, trying to find his way back home. The next day, at school, Mateo drew a picture of himself and his mom, but in the background, behind a tree, was the man in the suit. His art teacher, Ms. Wilson, looked at the picture for a long time. "Who's the man behind the tree?" she asked. "I don't know," Mateo said, "but he looks like he wants to say something." At recess, Mateo saw the fancy car again and the man waved at him. Later that day, he found a new book in his backpack. It was Where the Wild Things Are, with a note inside that said, "Sometimes the wild things are the ones who need to find their way home." Mateo put the book in his treasure box next to his adoption key and special rocks. That night, he asked his mom, "Do you believe in second chances?" She paused, then said, "Sometimes they're good, like with you and Danny, but sometimes they're complicated." Then Mateo asked, "Is that what the wild things were about? Going away to know they want to come home?" His mom smiled, kissed his forehead, and said, "Get some sleep, my wild thing." Late that night, Mateo saw the fancy car again. He wasn't scared. He felt like the man wasn't a bad guy, just someone lost, trying to find his way back. Mateo whispered, "Good night, sad man," and went back to bed, dreaming of wild things, second chances, and how grown-ups made simple things so complicated. Then, in the building, Martina Cabrera arrived. She was wearing an expensive suit. She looked at Isabel, who was busy with her work. "I see you didn't respond to my email," Martina said, closing the door. She looked at Isabel's office as if judging everything. "I thought it was time we talked about what you're doing to my son." Isabel replied, "I haven't seen Javier in 5 years. You're the one who ruined everything." Martina didn't like that, but Isabel kept going. Javier needed to focus on the company, not on being happy with someone who loves him for who he is, not for what he can become. Isabel opened a folder with medical records. "Here's proof the diagnosis was wrong. I could have children, but I didn't tell Javier because by then I knew you didn't just want a grandchild. You wanted control. I adopted Mateo because when I held him, nothing else mattered." Isabel nodded. "Maybe we can find a way forward for him." Mateo returned with an ice cream cone, his face bright with excitement. Carousel rides need ice cream, he said. Isabel and Javier walked together with Mateo, the three of them talking and laughing. They felt connected by Mateo, even though they kept some distance between them. Maybe we can find a way forward for him, Javier said as they watched Mateo enjoy his ice cream. Maybe, Isabel said softly. Meanwhile, Martina was at her son's office watching everything she had built fall apart. You're being ridiculous, she said to Javier, picking up a drawing from the desk. Javier took the drawing back and said, Mateo and I are getting to know each other. Isabel's allowing supervised visits. Martina didn't understand. If that boy is really Roberto's grandson, he's Isabel's son, Javier said firmly. If I'm lucky enough to be part of his life, it will be on their terms, not yours, not mine. Martina was still upset. She said, You think you can stop me? The Carter name, the inheritance. Isabel interrupted. Mateo has a birth certificate, adoption papers, and 5 years of legal documentation. But more importantly, he has love. Real love, not the conditional kind you offer. Martina watched them, her carefully built world cracking. But she had nothing else to say. She walked out, leaving Javier and Isabel with Mateo. Mateo wanted to see where I work, Javier said. Can Javier come with us? Mateo asked. I'm testing for my yellow belt in karate. Isabel smiled. Of course, we'll go together. As they left the building, Martina stood by her car, watching them. She lifted her hand in a small wave, but her eyes were sad. She had given up too much for her ambitions, and now she was alone in her victory. Later, Javier got a call during a meeting at work. Mateo is missing, Isabel's voice said, filled with panic. Javier quickly left the meeting. I'm on my way, he said. Call the police. When he reached the school, it was chaos. Police cars lined the street. Isabel was standing with 2 officers, holding Mateo's backpack. She looked scared but determined. As Mrs. Thompson answered their questions, one of the police officers said, You mentioned your son might have gotten into a car with someone he knew. Isabel's voice was firm as she replied, Mateo knows the rules. Only me or Abigail are allowed to pick him up. Javier walked over and put a hand on Isabel's shoulder. She leaned into him without thinking, and he felt his heart twist. I'm Javier Carter, he said to the officers. I'd like to help in any way I can. I have resources. Just then, a noise came from the school entrance. Martina Cabrera walked in with her usual grace, but there was something stronger about her today. She walked up to the officers. Commissioner Blake is on his way, she said. In the meantime, have you checked the security footage? The younger officer stood up straighter. We're waiting for technical support, he said. Unacceptable, Martina said. She pulled out her phone. I have a private security team that can get those feeds in 5 minutes. Isabel stepped forward. Mrs. Cabrera, I appreciate the offer, but Martina met her eyes and said softly, Let me do this, please. Something passed between them, a shared understanding and fear for a child they both wanted to protect. Isabel nodded. Things moved quickly after that. Martina's team arrived with fancy equipment, and Commissioner Blake worked with patrol cars. Javier called in favors from every surveillance company in the city. The last footage shows him walking toward the park, a security expert said. He was alone, but seemed to be following something. Isabel grabbed Javier's arm. The park? Did he say which entrance? The west side near the carousel, the expert replied. They understood at the same time. They rushed to the park with police officers following them. The carousel was silent, its painted horses standing still. But past it, barely visible in the growing dusk, was the children's reading garden, where Isabel sometimes took Mateo after school. They found him there, curled up under a tree, asleep with his book, Where the Wild Things Are. Mateo! Isabel cried. She hugged him tightly. Javier and the police caught up with them. Mom, Mateo blinked sleepily. I'm sorry. I saw a lost puppy and followed it, but then I couldn't find my way back. I came here because you told me to go somewhere familiar and stay put. Isabel kissed his hair. Oh, wild thing, you scared us so much. Javier knelt beside them. His hand shook as he touched Mateo's shoulder, making sure he was real and safe. Javier, Mateo said, surprised. You came too? Of course I came, Javier said, his voice rough. We all did. Mateo looked past them to where Martina stood with the police. Her usual calm was softened by visible relief. Even your mom? Mateo asked. Even my mom, Isabel answered, smiling. Later, after the police left and everyone had given their statements, they sat in Isabel's living room. Mateo had finally fallen asleep on the couch, his head in Isabel's lap and his feet across Javier's legs. Martina sat in an armchair, looking oddly comfortable in the cozy space despite her fancy clothes. He could have been taken, Martina said quietly. All my influence, all our family's power, and he could have just disappeared. But he wasn't, Isabel said, stroking Mateo's hair. He found his way to safety. Martina nodded. He remembered what he was taught, because you taught him well. Isabel smiled. You gave him something I never gave him, Martina said, her voice soft. The strength to find his own way home. Javier watched his mother, seeing for the first time how much age had touched her face. He said, We all found our way home today, in different ways. Isabel's hand found his, and they held hands over Mateo's sleeping form. Martina saw them and stood up to leave. I should go, Isabel, but thank you for letting me help. After she left, Javier and Isabel sat quietly together, listening to Mateo's soft breathing. The next weekend, Isabel woke to the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. She found Javier and Mateo trying to make dinosaur-shaped pancakes with flour all over their clothes. Mom, Mateo called, holding up a pancake that looked a little like a dinosaur. Javier says Grandpa Roberto used to make pancakes like this too. Isabel paused in the doorway. She wasn't surprised, but the sight was so familiar now, and it made her heart swell. Did he make them in funny shapes? She asked. They usually looked more like clouds, Javier said, wiping flour from Mateo's nose. Your mom's the real artist in the family. Family, Mateo repeated, looking up at Javier and Isabel with a big smile. They shared a small, happy moment before Isabel realized that Mateo had started to understand the meaning of family. Later, while Mateo was changing for their trip to the zoo, Isabel found Javier staring at family photos on the wall. A new one had joined the collection, the three of them at the carousel. I gave notice at Carter Industries yesterday, Javier said quietly. Not completely leaving, but stepping back from being CEO. I want to focus on something that really matters. Isabel nearly dropped her coffee mug. What? I'm starting a foundation, he explained. I want to help families, support adoption services, and fund fertility research. Isabel sat down, surprised. You don't have to change everything just because I finally understand what matters most, Javier said. He smiled. That night Mateo was missing, watching you with the police officers. I realized you've built something real here, Isabel. A good life. Isabel smiled, her eyes full of warmth. It's not perfect, she warned. Perfect is overrated, Javier said. He pulled the brass compass from his pocket. Perfect doesn't teach you how to find your way home. There was a knock at the door. Through the window, they saw Martina holding something. Isabel opened the door and Martina handed her an old book. I found this while going through some things, Martina said. It's a photo album Roberto used to keep. Pictures of Javier growing up. I thought Mateo might like to see his father as a little boy. Isabel took the album, her hands trembling. Martina, I'm not asking for anything, Martina interrupted. I just wanted to give this to you. Watching Javier with Mateo, I remembered how Roberto used to be with him, before I convinced him that work was more important than bedtime stories. She stopped at the door and added, I've arranged to transfer some Carter Industries shares into a trust for Mateo's education. No strings attached. Thank you, Isabel said, surprised. You've given my son back his smile, the real one. Later, at the zoo, Mateo ran between exhibits, showing Javier his favorite animals. They stopped for ice cream, watching sea lions play. Mateo showed them a story he had written in his notebook about three wild things who get lost but find each other again. See, Mateo said, pointing to the pictures. That's you, and that's Mom, and that's me in the middle. Isabel squeezed Javier's hand as Mateo turned the page to show them a fourth figure. That's Grandpa Roberto, watching from the stars. And here's Mrs. Cabrera. She's learning not to be so scared of wild things anymore. Javier asked gently. Scared of wild things? Mom says grown-ups sometimes get scared of loving too much, Mateo explained, so they try to control everything. But you can't control love. It's wild. Isabel looked at Javier, remembering how they had both tried to control their future instead of trusting their hearts. But here they were, learning to let love lead them home. Later, as Mateo showed off his karate moves, Javier showed Isabel the papers for the foundation. I'm thinking of calling it the Robert II Cabrera Family Foundation, he said. It'll help families find their way to each other. Isabel smiled. I might know some good children's books about families that could help with the materials. Javier's face lit up. I was hoping you'd say that. The foundation needs a creative director, someone who understands both the corporate and human sides. Isabel hesitated. Javier, just think about it, he said quickly. No pressure. We can take it slow. Mateo bounded in, wearing his karate uniform. Mom, can we have dinner in the garden like a picnic, please? Isabel looked at Mateo, their son, and smiled. Why not? It's a perfect night for wild things. Spring had come to Central Park. The carousel's music drifted through the air again. Isabel sat on their usual bench, editing a manuscript for the new children's series about different types of families. She smiled at the illustration of a little boy with two homes, two sets of parents, and twice the love. Mom, Mateo called from across the playground. Watch this! Isabel looked up and saw Mateo showing Javier a karate move. Javier clapped and cheered for him, both of them wearing casual clothes, which still surprised Isabel sometimes. Javier was in jeans and wearing a dinosaur tie that Mateo had picked out for his birthday. The foundation's office, where they were, was nothing like Carter Industries' big, fancy tower. Instead, it was in a cozy old building with lots of books and children's art on the walls. Isabel's office was next to a library she had designed, where families could find resources and stories to help them. Martina's voice came from behind Isabel. She had arrived with a picnic basket. Roberto would have loved this, Martina said. Isabel made space for Martina to sit on the bench, and she accepted the coffee Martina offered. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it had grown into its own special rhythm. Martina came to Mateo's karate tournaments and school plays, sharing stories and photos about Roberto, Mateo's grandfather, who Mateo would never meet but knew through the stories Martina told. Isabel smiled as she watched Javier help Mateo climb a tree, making sure he was safe while also encouraging him to be independent. Javier carried a brass compass in his pocket, something he still kept with him as a reminder of his past. Martina spoke again, this time softly. Did I tell you I'm selling the house in Connecticut? It's too big and too empty. I found a new place near here, if that's okay with you. Isabel thought about Mateo's latest drawing on the fridge. It showed their growing family. Isabel and Javier holding hands, Martina reading stories, and Abigail bringing ice cream. There was even a star in the sky with a note saying, Grandpa Roberto watching over us. Isabel smiled, thinking of Mateo's words. Wild things need their pack, he had said. She remembered the song Beautiful Dreamer, which had played when Javier and Mateo first rode the carousel together. Suddenly, Mateo ran over to them, grabbing both Javier and Martina's hands. Everyone has to ride this time. Mom, too. Isabel gathered her papers, but Javier was already there, offering his hand to her. Ready for another ride? Isabel looked around at her little family, Mateo's bright eyes, Martina's gentle smile, and Javier reaching out his hand. The manuscript could wait. Some moments needed to be lived fully. Race you to the purple unicorn, Isabel said, and they all ran, laughing like kids. They rode the carousel together, Isabel on the unicorn, Javier on the black stallion, Mateo on his favorite horse in front, and Martina on a zebra at the back. As they spun around under the lights, Isabel saw their reflections in the mirrors. 4 people becoming a family, not through blood or family rules, but through love and choice. Later that night, after Mateo was asleep and Javier had gone home to his apartment nearby, Isabel found a note in her manuscript folder. It was written in Martina's neat handwriting. The Carter legacy was never about business or bloodlines. Roberto knew that it took losing everything to make me remember. Thank you for teaching us all how to be wild again. Isabel added the note to Mateo's memory box, along with a photo from Javier's old office, the adoption day keys, and the book Where the Wild Things Are, which had started their journey back to each other. She placed the brass compass on top, the one Javier had given to Mateo because he no longer needed it. Javier knew that Mateo knew where home was now. In Mateo's room, the moonlight shone on his latest art project, a family tree that looked different from others. Instead of lines connecting people, he had drawn a carousel with people he loved riding horses, connected by ribbons flying in the wind. Not by blood, but by love. Isabel touched the key at her throat and thought about all the paths that had led them here. Tomorrow would bring foundation meetings, school runs, karate lessons, and family dinners. Martina would bring more photos. Javier would help with homework, and Mateo would write more stories about wild things finding their way home. But tonight, in the quiet of their house that had become their home, Isabel whispered the same words she had said on Mateo's adoption day, words that meant even more now. Let the wild rumpus start. And somewhere in the stars above, Isabel could almost hear Roberto Cabrera laughing joyfully, proud of the family his son had finally found. Not one built by rules or family expectations, but one made by love, forgiveness, and the wildness in their hearts. Thanks for watching. If you liked the story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Check out our other videos too. See you in the next one.